an excerpt from a poem called Why Is We Americans? But reality is an excerpt on television. Why is we Americans? Why is we Americans? Boodee-da, 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 boodoo-da. Boo-dee-boo-dee-boo-dee-boo-dee-boo. What I want is me, for real. I want me and myself, and what that is what I be and what I see and feel, and who is me and the what it is and who it is, and when it me is what it be. I'm gonna be here if I want, like I said, self-determination. But I ain't come from a foolish tribe. We wants the mule, the land. You can make it 300 years of blue chip stock in the entire operation. We want to be paid in a central bank, the average worker farmer wage for all those years we gave it free. Plus we want damages for all the killings and the fraud, the lynchings, the missing justice, the lies and frame-ups, the unwarranted jailings, the tar and featherings, the character and race assassinations, historical slander, ugly caricatures. For every Sambo, step and fetch it flick, we want to be paid. For every hurtful thing you did or said, for all the land you took, for all the rapes, all the Rosewoods and Black Wall Street you destroyed, all the miseducation, jobs lost, segregated shacks we lived in, the disease that ate and killed us, for all the mad police that drilled us, for all the music and dances you stole, the styles, the language, the hip clothes you copped, the careers you stopped. All these are suits, specific litigation as represent we, be like we, for reparations for damages paid to the Afro-American nation. Boodee-da, boodee-da, boodee-da. We want education for all of us and anyone else in the black belt hurt by slavery, for all the native peoples, even them poor white people you show all the time is funny, all them Abners and Daisy Mays, them Beverly Hillbillies who never got to know Beverly Hills, who never got to Harvard on their grandfather's wills. We want reparations for them, right on, for the Mexicans whose land you stole, for all of North Mexico, you call it Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado, all that, all that, all that, all that. Be-dee-da, doo-doo, ba-ba-ba-ba, doo-dee-doo. All that you got to give up. Autonomy and reparation to the Chicanos and the Native Americans whose soul you ripped out with their land. Give self-determination, regional autonomy. That's what Maui is asking, and they're going to do the same when they demand it like us again in their own exploited name. Yeah, the education, that's right. 200 years. We want a central stash, a central bank with democratically elected trustees and a board elected by us all to map out from the referendum we set up what we want to spend it on to build that Malcolm sense self-determination as self-reliance and self-respect and self-defense, the will of what the good Dr. Du Bois beat on, true self-consciousness, simply the psychology of freedom. Boo-dee-da, boo-dee-da, bee-dee-da, boo-dee-da, da, ba-ba-ba, boo-dee-boo-dee-boo-boo-boo. Then we can talk about being American. Then we can listen. Then we can listen without the undercurrent of desire to first set your on fire. We will only talk of voluntary unity, of autonomy as vective arms of self-determination if there is democracy in you. That is where it will be shown. This is the only way we as Americans, this is the only truth that can be told. Otherwise, there is no future between us but war, and we as rather lovers and singers and dancers and poets and drummers and actors and runners and elegant heartbeats of the sun's flame. But we is also at the end of our silence and sit down. We is at the end of being under your ignorant smell, your intentional hell. Either give us our lives or plan to forfeit your own.
Sonia Sanchez, your reaction to the the news of Amiri Baraka's death.
Good morning to you, my dear brother, and the rest of the brothers and Sister Amy. How are you doing this morning?
Good. Very well, Sonia.
Yeah, it is good hearing all of you. My dear brother Juan, like everyone else, we were more than shocked because we always could never imagine ourselves on this earth without dear brother Amiri and his family. Every time you started out during the day, you would say hello to him and his family in Newark. You would say hello to all those brothers and sisters who were part of what I call that magnificent generation of the 60s. These men and women who proceeded to change the world. They came out and they decided very much to change the world. And so when I heard from Sister Amina in Newark, when she called and told us he had made transition, you know, your first response is, vete y no vete, you know, to have seen you and to see you no more. But then after you say that, and after you move and go outside and walk 12 blocks, you come back and realize simply that he lives. He lives, he will always live. He will always live in the hearts of all of us, in the hearts of young people and young poets and people who have some kind of moral grounding, because this man moved in such a large way to effect change in this place called America and in the world.
Kamosi Woodard, you wrote a biography of Amiri Baraka. You're a professor of history at Sarah Lawrence College. The title of your book, A Nation Within a Nation, Amiri Baraka and Black Power Politics. Give us a thumbnail sketch of Amiri's life.
Well, he was born in Newark, New Jersey during the Great Depression in 1934. Leroy Jones, kind of named after his father. And he went to Howard University, where he met Toni Morrison, Andy Young, and people like that generation. He dropped out of, you know, people think he graduated from Howard, but he dropped out in his last semester of his senior year, and he joined, in disgrace, he joined the Air Force. And he got kicked out of the Air Force. And then he became, he joined the Beat Poets down in Greenwich Village, where he began to, it's kind of phenomenal. He became an editor of the Beat Poetry. He just took it upon himself, that he took that agency, that he could take all the great poets and begin to collect that new American poetry. He went to Cuba in 1960 at the invitation of Fidel Castro, and with a delegation of black writers. He met Robert Williams there, who was a famous NAACP activist for self-defense. When he got back, he hooked up with Malcolm X. There's a famous meeting late January 1965 between Malcolm X, Abdul Rahman Babu, and Amiri Baraka that lasted all night, where they discussed the international strategy for black liberation. Malcolm X is killed a few weeks later. Baraka leaves Greenwich Village and goes to Harlem to found the Black Arts Repertory Theatre School, 1965. Jazz musicians held a concert to raise the money for that new school and theater. Baraka had already written Blues People, which is an important work for him because I think he found his poetic voice by studying the blues. And the rest is history. You know, he formed many Black Power organizations. At his 75th birthday celebration, he and Sonia celebrated their 75th birthday a few years ago. And there were perhaps 1,000 artists and actors there. And it occurred to me in the middle of that celebration that all of those people were his former students. So I think like his mentor, Sterling Brown, was asked, what is your greatest work? Brown said, my students. And I think Baraka would say the same thing.
Absolutely. And Felipe, you were one of those students. You met him in that period of the Black Arts movement. You yourself were a member of the Last Poets. Talk about first meeting Amiri and his influence on your life.
1967, we had started a group called the Last Poets, and it was Guyland Kane, Abiodun Oyewole, and David Nelson, and they introduced me. It was the first Black and Puerto Rican aggregation. It had not happened before. And I met him with an enormous amount of trepidation. He started the Black Arts movement, as our esteemed professors said, and we followed in that tradition 4 years later. And immediately he embraced me. Amiri was the only intellectual, Black intellectual, intellectual that I've met who was able to bring together militancy with intellect. Militancy, aggressive action with scholarship. He was an incredibly learned man. He could quote Tennyson, Yeats, Wadsworth, Walt Whitman. He knew Ginsberg, introduced me to Allen Ginsberg. I feel, so I was in awe. He always told me it's important to read and write and read. And he said that what is the use, this is the first thing he told me, what is the use of being ethereal and being escapist and romantic? Take the words and make them into bullets. Take the words and make them do something. In fact, it was his poetry, his motivation, that led me from the Last Poets into the Young Lords.
Speaking of poetry, I'd like, before we go to Adimu, as we're sort of chronologically the people who met him through their lives, all of you, and most have known him for over 40 years. Adimu, your name is Adimu because of Amiri. But Kamosi Woodard, would you set up this poem for us? Amiri Baraka reading the poem, It's Nation Time. This is 1970. It's right before Adimu, you met him, at the founding conference of the Congress of African People. Now, a warning, the N-word is repeated numerous times during this reading. Give us context.
Well, we were in a political campaign in 1970 to elect the first black mayor of Newark, and the workload was heavy. One person late at night said, what time is it? As if they wanted to go home and quit the detail. And an old man named Baba Mshuri said, it's nation time. Baraka heard the story, and as he did with many of his poems, that story turned into this epic poem.
It's Nation Time, Amiri Baraka.
Come out, niggas, come out. Help us stop the devil. Help us build a new world, niggas. Come out, brothers. Are we with you and your sons, your daughters are ours? And we are the same, all the blackness from one black Allah. When the world is clear, you'll be with us. Come out, niggas, come out. Come out, niggas, come out. It's nation time. It's nation time. It's nation time. It's nation time. Chant with bells and drums. Nation time. It's nation time. Get up, Santa Claus. Get up, Roy Wilkins. Get up, Dinah Ross. Get up, Jimmy Brown. It's nation time. Build it. Get up, Muppet Bagger. Get up, now, for real. Come Master Ferrari. Last tour. Get up, nigga. Get up, nigga. Come over here, nigga. Take a bow, nigga. It's nation time.
That was Amiri Baraka reading his poem, It's Nation Time, in 1970 in Atlanta. In fact, that was the year, Larry Ham, that you first met Amiri Baraka. Where?
Yes, Amiri Baraka came and spoke at my school, Arts High School, in 1970.
That was where?
That was in Newark, New Jersey. That was our first encounter, but our actual first meeting was in August of 1971. I had been appointed to the Newark Board of Education at the age of 17.
You were the youngest person ever.
Youngest school board member in the country. I wasn't even old enough to vote yet, but I was appointed by Mayor Gibson, whose election as the first African-American mayor of Newark was in part made possible by Amiri Baraka. So our first meeting was in August of 1971. And then you mentioned my name, Adimu Chunga. He gave me that name. I requested an African name after being a delegate to the National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana in March of 1972. I came out of the ghetto off of 12th Street, off of Ridgewood Avenue, and going to the National Black Political Convention in Gary was an epiphany for me. It was my revolutionary transformation. And then after that, I asked Baraka for an African name, and he gave me the name Adimu Chunga in 1972, in March of 1972. Amiri Baraka, I believe, was a great American revolutionary. And whatever desire I have in me for revolutionary social transformation comes from him.
Well, you mentioned meeting him in Newark, and I want to talk about Newark, to turn to another clip of Amiri Baraka. He appeared on Democracy Now! In 2007 on the 40th anniversary of the Newark Rebellion. And I asked him to talk about why the uprising began.
You have to start with slavery, because those abuses have never been eradicated. You know, people are not living in slums because they voted to. You know, their children not in jail because they wanted them to. You know, these are the results of people who've been oppressed and suffer national oppression, you know. And so in a city like Newark, which is the third oldest city in the United States, by the way, where all these kind of abuses sort of converge, you know, and the racism on top of that, you know, I mean, I mean, one absurd example is one time I was directing a play, and the police rushed into the loft, and the man actually took the script out of my hand, you know, as if it was some kind of a volatile weapon, you know. So that day we had been picketing because they had beaten up a black cab driver, a guy named John Smith. And so people gathered at that precinct, and then that was very explosive that night. That was the night before, that was, say, the 11th. So the next day we were picketing that precinct because that's where it happened. And that was the day, by the time the sun started going down, that's when it broke out.
Now, we saw a clip of Mayor Adonisio, but could you talk a little bit about the political climate, the mayor's regime, as well as Anthony Imperiale was running around then in those days, and what was the climate that the majority population, the black community in Newark was feeling then?
See, first of all, when you say Adonisio, who was indicted and, you know, what was it? He was given 1% of the city's budget to the mob.
He was the mayor.
He was the mayor, Adonisio, No Neck Adonisio. And his Spina, okay, was it was interesting that Spina, who was the police chief, when they beat me up, they didn't take me to prison or they took me to Spina's office, you know, and threw me on the floor. And he says, you know, just like right out of the movies, they got you, you know. And I said, but I ain't dead.
He was head of police?
Yeah, he was the police chief, you know.
And they brought you to his
office, not to jail. Mm-hmm. But since I had given my given name, Everett L. Jones, laborer, you know, then they could deny until my wife got hold of Allen Ginsberg, and he got hold of Jean-Paul Sartre, and Sartre called the police station.
From France?
Yeah, called the police station. Sartre and Ginsberg and those people started, you know. And then the only reason I got my life saved is the people in the apartment building where they were beating me start throwing things out of the window at them. Otherwise, I would be gone, you know. Mm. But it was a very, the racism that existed
by
there.
then you were already a very well-known poet and published author.
And harassing them, you know, in that town. See, the town's too small for you to be doing something. I mean, they actually have policemen stop a poetry reading. I mean, that's how wild it was getting. They would ride up and down the street and make remarks at my wife and the other ladies in that block, calling them all kinds of slurs. I mean, this was a nightly thing. And so it became like, you know, back and forth, you know. And finally, it just erupted. We were trying to do things. We were putting out literature suggesting that we could have a mayor. We could have a city council. You know, Stokely had come out with Black Power, and I was spray paint Black Power in all these buildings in the city, you know. So they knew who it was. And once I got arrested, they ran in my house to destroy all of the leaflets and stuff that we were, but my wife was smart enough to get that stuff out of there and move it to somebody else's house down the street. But they destroyed our mimeograph machines and stuff like that. They destroyed my car, you know. I mean, it was, you know, search and destroy mission because they knew who it was, you know, in that little context. But the whole city, you know, as Harper's Magazine said, the worst city in the United States was Newark. 18,000 people density in 1 square mile, you know, talking about the project. So it was a city that was always on the verge, you know.